Hello, everybody, and welcome back. I am thrilled for you to join us here at the last session. I would like to say save the best for last, but I know that there were fabulous presentations that have happened throughout the meeting. I'm Jen Horonjeff. I'm the founder and CEO of Savvy Cooperative, which is a patient-owned co-op that helps to connect companies and innovators directly with diverse patients and caregivers so that we can collaborate and co-create a better future together by understanding the needs of patients as we do innovate for the future. So I'm thrilled to be here today to help facilitate a conversation with a pharma company and a patient who have done just that. They have been working together to collaborate in much larger initiatives, and we're only going to be able to scratch the surface today. But I want to welcome my guests. So first of all, welcome to Hilary Wilson from Boehringer Ingelheim, and to Tawnya El-Masry, who is representing the Lummi Nation and is a patient with PAH. And I'll have them both give a quick hello and introduce a little bit about themselves. But I'm going to start off getting provocative from the very beginning, and they don't actually know what I'm about to ask them, so this is going to be fun. One of the things that I want to just acknowledge is that there are so many misunderstandings that are happening between pharma, between diverse communities, and just there's a lot that's out there. And so I'm going to sort of ask you both to respond to sort of a question as you give your introduction. So Hilary, I'm going to start with you. So please give us a little background on yourself, but also I'm curious what you think maybe is a misunderstanding about the drug development process that you think that, the general population, as we currently certainly see that there are misunderstandings. So just to sort of dabble in that a little bit as you think about sort of starting off this conversation. So welcome, Hilary.
All right, thanks. And thanks for the surprise question. I'm Hilary. I am the Director of Patient Engagement in our US organization at Boehringer Ingelheim. And really in this role, part of what I do is look at kind of a macro level, how we approach collecting and integrating patient input, through research all the way through to commercialization. So that's kind of the big picture of what I do. And, I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is when I talk to people that aren't in the pharma industry, or even the healthcare industry, is I think there's not really awareness about how much is involved and how much rigor and standards around how we conduct research to ensure that patients are safe in our trials. So I think that's one thing that always raises to the top for me.
Yeah, I appreciate that and excited to dig into your perspective much more throughout our time together today. And Tawnya, I welcome you to give a little bit about your background. And then also for you, I'm curious if we can sort of ask the reverse question. And what do you think that sort of like the pharma industry and the healthcare industry is not really understanding when it comes to thinking through sort of the needs of diverse communities? And obviously that is a very loaded question, but just, give us a few little things to start off the conversation today.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Tawnya, and I have PAH. I was diagnosed 4 years ago. It's a super rare heart and lung disease. And I'm also a member of the Lummi Nation, which is a Native American reservation in the Pacific Northwest. And I think that one thing that pharma companies maybe don't always think about when it comes to communities like mine, is that we are really isolated. And so I happen to live in the big city of Seattle, Washington, but and I have good access to great healthcare down here, but not everyone in communities like mine on the reservation has access to great health organizations or knowledge and information. So I think that is that's something that if you're a company to think about. It's not that we don't want to know these things, it's just that the information's not always there for us.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, and I know we're going to talk more about these things. And again, there's a lot that we could cover in our short time together today, but just to start to kind of unpack some of these things, I know that our fancy title for this session is, patient centricity in a post-COVID world, starts with inclusivity. So there's a lot happening even in that title. So thinking about the fact that, of course, we are living through a pandemic, And, at least in the United States, but we know globally as well, there's been much more of a focus also on making sure that we are being more inclusive and including diverse voices in the drug development process and beyond. And so thinking through this from where I sit, where we work with lots of companies, there is sort of a focus right now to try to really do the work and understand what's happening, with being more patient-centered, but also then focusing in on some communities that have been left out of the conversation. Now, it's all well and good for companies to say that they care about these things, but what does this look like in practice? And so before we get into some of the conversation here, wanting to sort of set the stage about kind of what's been happening. And Tawnya, I'm going to turn to you first. I would love for you to share the story that I know that I have heard about some of the things that you were just alluding to about sort of like what it came down to with a COVID-19 trial for you and your tribe. And did you have information? Were you asked to participate? What was that experience like? So if you can just share a little bit there for our audience to kind of understand a real example of this happening in the past year.
Yeah, absolutely. So you might have heard of COVID. Pandemic that's happening. And prior to the release of the vaccines, our tribe was asked to participate in clinical trials, and we were looking into that process. And we are lucky to have a Harvard-educated doctor on our Indian Health Service team who reached out and asked a lot of questions and did a lot of work with the company. And basically, what it came down to for the tribe as we got further and further along and closer to participation and opening up as a site, there wasn't transparency between the company and our tribe. So we were asking a lot of questions like, what are the risks and the benefits and what can happen, what's the actual science behind all of this? And there weren't answers that were coming forth that were really helping to satisfy what people wanted to know. And for those of you that may not know, we don't have a very, very trusting history when it comes to participating in clinical trials in our past. And so there's a lot of distrust to begin with. And so I think the lack of transparency, whether it was intentional or not, became a really big obstacle. And we decided not to participate in the clinical trial. However, on the flip side, when the vaccine was available, I was actually able to get vaccinated in my tribe way faster than I was to the state of Washington. And we were able to vaccinate our tribe very quickly because we did have the information at that point, and we were able to really break it down for everybody in the community, answer a lot of questions. Our doctors were really educated and helped everybody to make the best decision and get vaccinated. So yeah.
I really appreciate you sharing that perspective. I think there's a lot of sort of aha moments that people hopefully already have just hearing that, that comparison, that it was you needed the information then, and once you had the information, you could make an informed decision. And Hilary, I know that we've been working together between BI and Savvy to help facilitate some of these conversations over the past year and a half. But let's back up. Let's talk about why was this something that BI thought was actually important to do the work to talk to patients? Like I say, we know that everyone's thinking that it's important, but people are sort of taking different pathways to get there. So if you could share a little bit about sort of the thought process that led up to us engaging, this patient council, which Tawnya is a part of, to help inform the work that you're all doing. I'd love to hear sort of your thought process, which I think is going to resonate with a lot of other people listening in.
Yeah, sure. So, patient centricity, it's been a focus in the industry for, many years now. Jen, you've been there since the beginning for that. And it's at this point within BI, one of our guiding principles. And we've done a lot of work in the past several years to really build in opportunities and expectations for collecting patient input to inform the design of our trials and, our medical affairs strategies. But in, the last couple of years, as we've started to get more of that process built into the very way in which we approach drug development, we recognized in this era of COVID that, obviously social determinants of health and even cultural beliefs and practices influence how patients think about and experience and access care. And that's not new. We've known that for a long time, but it really led us to challenge ourselves in how we're approaching patient engagement, because we feel like the next step in the evolution of our approach to patient engagement is that we really need to start systematically defining what the key subgroups are, whether they be gender identity, race, ethnicity, clinical severity subgroups, and looking at what are our cultural considerations for each of these, what are social determinants of health, and how are those going to play into decisions that we have to make, and if we're trying to really develop and provide access to medicines to all the patients that are impacted by the disease areas that we're in. And we do prioritize co-creation. And so as we're embarking on this journey really to revisit and refresh our approach to patient engagement with that, cultural lens in mind, we wanted to hear from patients. And we worked with you guys at Savvy, to find patients that we don't always hear from, when we're doing patient engagement activities, so that we could kind of create, this bi-directional conversation. So as we're revisiting our approaches, that we can get advice, from people that are typically from communities that are underrepresented in our ecosystem.
Yeah, I appreciate hearing a little bit of the background there. And I think for our audience, one of the things that has been nice working with BI, particularly in these areas of diversity and inclusion, is this sort of continuous feedback loop that happens after there's some patient co-creation exercise. They're, thinking about what they heard and then going back to the community to say, hey, here is what we learned, here's what we're thinking. And Tawnya, for somebody who's participated in these things with BI, but also beyond, how does it feel for you to be included in these conversations? And not only just, again, hearing that you're being asked the questions, but to hear that things are or are not, this is not, you don't have to say just like rosy things, but hearing what is happening, how does that feel as a patient to be included in the conversation?
It's actually really wonderful. It's a great experience to be asked to be a part of these panels. I think one of the things that you forget about when you're a part of a community is that everyone else isn't aware of what your community might be like. And so, being able to say things and have people go, oh my gosh, I didn't know that, is really, it's great. And then also for me to be able to learn things about other people as well in their cultural experiences has been really interesting. And I think for me personally, if there's any way that I can help to, to help people get access to good healthcare and the things that they need, I'm all for that, because I think it's really important. And, it means a lot to me personally. So yeah, it's been a great experience.
I appreciate you also calling out sort of what you also are sort of getting just being part of some of the conversations. It's actually something we hear over and over again is when we're putting patients, we do a lot of these different types of workshops and they say, oh my gosh, it was so refreshing to hear other people's perspectives, even if they're different. But I'll never forget one sort of asynchronous workshop that was happening. And it was a fairly common condition, but somebody who just was never involved in patient communities, hearing what other people had shared, had actually said, wow, this feels almost like a therapy session for me. And so I think that we need to understand that a lot of us that have been doing this for a long time have been connected with other patients, and it's kind of like old hat. But if we want to be more inclusive, bringing new people and new voices into the conversations, and also understanding and supporting them through that process, because there are a lot of feelings that happen because we're talking about things that are very sensitive. And when I talk to patients and interview them, I sort of always lay the disclaimer that we're going to bring up things that I want to understand that they're going to be sensitive and maybe uncomfortable to relive that, and that people don't have to talk about it if they're not comfortable with it, but just also sharing that appreciation that you understand that these are challenging conversations. Patients are not just vessels to say, give me your insights. We need to really be really thoughtful and respectful about even the exercise with which we talk to patients. So I appreciate you sharing that, Tawnya.
Could I add on that, Jen?
Please, of course.
Because it also, I think about the experience of some of the colleagues that I've heard that have participated, in some of the meetings that we've had. And the experiences are also really difficult to hear and recognize. And, there are some people within BI that have been driving work around diversity in clinical trials for 15 years, but what I see as really different about, we're still talking about the problem, that's always the pushback. We can't just keep talking about it and admiring the problem. But, to hear from patients and have them share their stories where we're not talking about them and the problem, we're having a conversation about what the challenges are. Because if we're just having a conversation with executives at BI, no matter, each of our individual backgrounds, we all work at a pharma company, we're all gainfully employed, have access to healthcare, so we can talk about it. But until we actually, hear from patients that are in communities that are underrepresented, may not have equitable access to healthcare, it's actually taking their voice and raising it and elevating it within the organization that I see as helping us drive real change.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that, and I couldn't agree more. It's actually hearing the words of patients, not just quantitative data that we need to enroll this many more from these different communities. It's like, let's hear their actual stories.
Well,
and I know that. Oh, sorry, Tawnya.
I was just going to jump in and say, and I think for me as a patient, I was diagnosed with my disease 4 years ago. My cousin actually has the same rare disease. But because of access to healthcare, she didn't know that. And the people there didn't have the tools to really diagnose her. And she died after 2 years of having this disease. So for me, it's people I know, it's my family, it's, and having better access and having people be aware of us and that we're here and that we also suffer from these diseases and that somebody should talk to us. Those kinds of things mean a lot to me. Now, being able to get treatment for this disease, I feel like is a privilege for me. And so the more that people listen, the more people that I know get help, like my cousins and my brother, so it means a lot to me too.
Yeah, I appreciate that context, and truly it kind of ties back to even sort of why I started doing this work in a larger way with Savvy. Is just there were so many patients in my community as a patient, and the parents, because I have a pediatric illness, that they just didn't know where to turn. They didn't know who to talk to. They had all these things of why are things like this, but there was no way to connect. And so it's great that now there is more interest from the industry to connect, and now I just have the honor of helping to facilitate conversations like this so that we can get more voices in there. Hilary, I want to go back to something that you were just talking about, is that, internally people were starting to hear what patients were saying. And I know that it was starting to bring some things up. And I'm curious sort of what you were hearing, of what you can share. And what did sort of you learn about yourselves, as an organization, through going through this process where, to also fill the audience in, when we did this sort of, open dialogue between people at BI as well as the patient council, a lot of questions were asked that BI didn't have. The people on the call, were respectfully just saying I'm going to go get those answers for you. I don't have them offhand. And so, Hilary, then what happened? What was that process like?
Yeah. And, I think maybe it's helpful to give a little bit of context to the work, because we reached out initially, Jen, and we're thinking of a discrete project, and we that was maybe last, fall, and we did a workshop and then had, this live panel where, more than 400 employees from the BIUS organizations joined and really heard directly from patients, their individual stories and what they saw as barriers to improving specifically diversity in clinical trials. And you both remember that. I mean, it was very raw, unedited conversation, and it made people feel a little bit uncomfortable. It also really, I think, made people think differently. And start to drive conversations, no matter what their job is at BI, but, continue conversations, advance conversations. Then, that one of the big themes that came out of that was we want, bi-directional engagement, and we want transparency. We want to know, when we're giving you our insights, what are you doing with them? Full transparency. And so as an outcome of that, we did set up this longer term, diversity inclusion patient council. And, we're doing a series of workshops where we ask questions of the council, and including Tawnya. And then we also have these town hall meetings where we at BI report back and answer questions. This is what we heard, and this is what we're doing. And in the town hall that we had, I think that's what you're referring to, Jen, is there were just all these questions raised, and we don't have all the answers, and I think to me, over, the period of 5 to 6 weeks after that, it just stimulated a lot of meetings, a lot of, okay, so what are we doing here? What are we doing here? And honestly, I was surprised, pleasantly surprised. That I feel that we're doing more than me as one employee was aware of. I mean, we're an organization of, 50,000 plus. So there's a lot of things that are happening, but they're not connected. And I think that what we're learning is that we have a long way to go in terms of making this more, standard operating procedure. But I was also, pleasantly surprised to see that there's been a tremendous amount of work that's already ongoing.
Yeah, and I think that, we're about to share some information back with the council, and I'm really excited to hear kind of their response to the ways that you were able to address what you know and what you don't know. And I think that sort of approaching all of this work with humility is really the starting off point, that we need to work together, because like you say, Hilary, no one person is going to know all the things about an organization or about the right steps, but we'll get there faster together. As we have only a few minutes left here, I do invite, for those watching in live, if you do have questions, by all means, throw them in the chat. We have fabulous people on here that can help answer some of those questions, but I'm going to keep going until I see other folks chime in with any questions that they might have. So, one of the things that I kind of want to touch on as well is thinking about how can we see opportunities for our listeners to think about, oh, okay, well, maybe I could go back and try that in my own work and community, be it whichever side of the equation they may be on, or both. So I'm curious, Hilary, if you might be able to also share some things that maybe bubbled up about new opportunities that you all are thinking about co-creation. And then, Tawnya, I'm going to ask you, where do you want to see more? Like, where are there places that you see opportunities for patients to get more involved? So Hilary, any places that you're already sort of thinking about are important to have more patient dialogue?
Yeah, I mean, I think even that, conversation, Tawnya, that you brought up in the town hall around, you didn't have the transparency, in the answers that you wanted to know, the tribe wanted to know in order to participate in the trial. So, what can we do? Part of that is the literacy and knowing the kinds of questions in advance. So, even creating, conversations now around, future trials. What are the questions that you have or that you may have about a future trial, and how can we proactively start to address those? So when we're at the point where we're actually, bringing on, sites and planning our trials, you're not starting that conversation. So that's certainly one area.
Thanks for that. And Tawnya, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a patient, sort of to answer your question, I mean, I think part of that also is knowing the risks and like I mentioned, the side effects, those kinds of things. What are the potentials? I think those are always the most important. But also, when the vaccines were released, we had all the science on how they worked, right? Like how they work in your body. What does that do? And so I think for me personally, when I was able to see that, I was like, oh, this is super safe, and this is, this isn't an inactive, this isn't going to give me COVID, these kinds of basic questions. But also, not just answering the question and saying, no, it's not, but actually tell me how, and tell me exactly what the breakdown is and how does it work, in the body, what's it doing, give me the science. Because I think sometimes people actually study and learn a lot more about these things, in their own way. We're not doctors, but I think, when you've got things that are wrong with you, you become a lot more curious about how your body works and what the science is behind that. So
That's really interesting, Tawnya, because I think that, we would typically in the life cycle development, come up with videos around how the science, the mechanism of action works, for a particular product later, because there is this balance of how much do we invest, before we know it's going to work, right? But, raising that as that could be a very important piece of information to have even when you're going into, your clinical trials, your first clinical trials. Makes a lot of sense.
This is an amazing conversation here. And I think that that's some of the stuff that we continue to hear is that patients want more information and different like mediums and modalities with which they absorb information may differ just person to person because we're all different. And so making sure that things can be shared in accessible ways. I know Hilary at BI and beyond, people think about like lay person summaries perhaps to summarize clinical trial findings, but what is, kind of coming up here is, well, what do you actually want to know even coming into the trial? And is there a better sort of informed consent process that can not only say you're going to be asked to do X, Y, and Z during the trial, but like what the heck do we know about it to begin with? And all of that kind of stuff is really important as well. So I know that we only have a final minute here and we could talk forever. And luckily I have the esteemed privilege to be able to talk to you both, but I want to have you be able to share some, gems and wisdom with our audience before we sign off. So, again, our title being about what is sort of patient centricity in a post-COVID world. What are sort of the larger global qualities that you think are most important to be that better patient-centered organization or healthcare system as we think towards not going back to what we were pre-pandemic, but what can we take to create a better future for both the industry and patients alike going forward? So Hilary, I'll start with you.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I would certainly say, to other pharma companies that are listening is, first ask yourselves, we do this patient journey work. We understand kind of clinical segmentation, but are you thinking through, what, your segmentation might be by different cultural groups? And are you thinking about social determinants of health and how those might impact how you decide to, approach your development and even access and payer strategies? And then, don't forget to talk to patients along the way. Don't try to have these conversations in isolation, but go out and invest in your patient engagement activities in, many different patient groups.
Thank you, Hilary. And I always love giving patients the last word. So Tawnya, close us out here.
I mean, I think for me to answer that question is to say, connect with us. I think, if you're interested in working with communities, people of color, learn about us, educate yourself and try to understand a little bit about who we are and where we come from and what our history is so that you have a basic understanding of, us culturally when you reach out and ask to be a part of our community. Because I think the more that you respect us as people and humans, the better relationship that we can develop with each other. And I think that's where things are going to go in a good direction.
Yeah, well, that gives me goosebumps just to have that sort of final charge of understanding people first, who they are, before we start to engage and ask them for things. So thank you so much, both to Tawnya, to Hilary, to Next Pharma. Thank you for letting us all be a part of this wonderful summit. And I'm sure that the speakers here would be more than happy to answer any questions that you have remaining, myself as well. And until then, continue and remember to ask patients. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, Jen.
Thank you. Bye.